Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all full of coffee and pastry and ready to take a look at the art of noise, or how we turn that noise into meaningful conversations. This time, of course, not with ourselves, but with technology.
For millions of years, mankind lived just like the animals. Then something happened, which unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk.
That's Stephen Hawking from the Pink Floyd track, Keep Talking. And it's very true. At some point, humans learned to talk to each other. And with that, we opened up enormous possibilities for learning, creating, sharing, and innovating. And now, it seems, we live in a time when, despite the fact we perhaps haven't quite got the hang of talking to each other yet, we are doing our very best to find out how to talk to technology. Interestingly, this isn't a particularly new thing. We've been trying to recreate speech since the 1700s, when scientists created a mechanical model based on the voice box and the vocal cords that could pronounce the English vowel sounds, A, E, I, O, and U. We don't have any recordings of that time, of course, but we do have something from the past sort of 100 years or so. At the 1939 World's Fair in America, the voder was demonstrated. It was a mechanical tool that, again, like its earlier predecessors, was designed to emulate the behavior of air moving over a person's vocal cords.
The machine uses only two sounds produced electrically. One of these represents the breath. The other, the vibration of the vocal cords. There are no phonograph records or anything of that sort. Only electrical circuits such as are used in telephone practice. Let's see how you put expression into a sentence. Say, she saw me, with no expression.
She saw me.
Now say it in answer to these questions. Who saw you?
She saw me.
Whom did she see?
She saw me.
Did she see you or hear you?
She saw me.
So they might have got mechanical speech working, they didn't get sound quality, and in fact, if YouTube's anything to go by, we didn't get good sound quality for at least another 50 years or so. But if we roll forward a couple of decades, by 1961 at Bell Labs, they had created something that was closer to what we understand synthetic speech to be today. Using an IBM computer, they managed to get their synthetic speech to do this.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer too. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you.
And with that, they really set off the era of synthetic speech design, and also became the root cause of almost every robotic film seen in film history, including, of course, HAL singing the same song in 2001: A Space Odyssey, even as recently as The Theory of Everything, where this song gets referenced. It's a true synthetic speech or AI speech kind of icon now. If we move forward to the 70s, 1978 to be precise, speaking toys were becoming prevalent for children. Texas Instruments produced this Speak and Spell toy, which used synthetic speech to teach children how to spell.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K.
And I can just about remember these when I was a little girl, and they were revolutionary. It was extraordinary that you could have this technology that had every appearance of being able to talk to you. And we were so impressed by the fact that it could talk, that the quality of the speech really didn't matter to us. Interestingly, in the same year, another toy was released, this time the 2XL robot, with a very different style of talking.
Thank you for turning me on. Let me introduce myself. I am 2XL, the smartest toy robot in the world.
And what you might have detected from that is that the speech in that example is a lot more fluid than the previous example. And the reason being, this is one of the first examples where we cheated. We used recorded human voice to give the pretense of technology being able to communicate to us. And to some extent, as we'll see later, this is still something that happens today, even with relatively current methods for producing synthetic speech. In 1984, DECTalk Digital Equipment Corporation produced the first text-to-speech device. This, at the time, was a standalone hardware device, but this technology ultimately became software, and it became the voice that really fueled screen reader development over the next couple of decades. So technology used by blind people to listen to content instead of look at what's on screen.
I am Perfect Paul, the standard male voice.
I am Beautiful Betty, the standard female voice. Some people think I sound a bit like a man.
And here we see one of the first examples where we're trying to differentiate between voices. Most of the voices we've heard up to this point have been very robotic, slightly masculine, but pretty nondescript. Here, for the first time, they were trying at least to distinguish between male and female voices. How successful they were is perhaps another question, but it was that first kind of step into bringing humanity into some of these robotic voices. Something else happened in 1984. It was, of course, the now iconic launch of the Macintosh computer. And synthetic speech and talking to technology also made its appearance there.
Now, we've done a lot of talking about Macintosh recently. But today, for the first time ever, I'd like to let Macintosh speak for itself.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag. And accustomed as I am to public speaking, I'd like to share with you an action I thought of the first time I made an IBM mainframe. Never trust a computer you can't read.
Now, staged as it is, we see another thing that is become more and more common in conversations with technologies, a degree of humor. Humor is a wonderful way for humans to establish connections across each other, between each other, and almost from the start, we've tried to do the same thing with technology to, admittedly, varying degrees of success. Something happened almost a decade later. We started to get the other half of the conversation, our ability to talk to technology. And again, Apple came through with this in 1993.
Macintosh, open letter. Macintosh, print letter. Macintosh, fax letter.
While everyone else is still trying to build a computer you can understand.
Macintosh, shut down.
We've built a Macintosh that can understand you.
Goodbye.
It was never that easy. It took another 20 years for technology to get to the point where we could have conversations that really did behave like that. But in the meantime, a couple of years later, Dragon Naturally Speaking, still one of the most popular speech recognition tools on the market, was released. These tools are used by doctors and lawyers in particular who need easy dictation skills, but they're also used by people who can't use conventional input devices like mice and keyboards.
This is Dragon Naturally Speaking, speech recognition software that turns your voice into text 3 times faster than typing, with up to 99% accuracy, period.
And these tools took an extraordinary amount of training. When you bought them, you had to read passage after passage of well-known bits from books or other tracts of text that they put in front of you. It took a long time, and even then the recognition was pretty poor. You'd end up repeating yourself, deleting yourself. And if you want to see a great example of exactly such a conversation, Google for an article by Brian Cardell, who talks about the frustrations of using dictation and Dragon to have a sensible conversation and get some work done, because it's a priceless example of how tragically things can go wrong when you don't want them to. Things did get a lot easier in 2011, though, when Apple introduced Siri into iOS 5. And for the first time, we had what felt very much like conversations with our technology.
Siri, where can I find something to eat?
There are 25 Chinese restaurants located on Spadina.
I don't want Chinese food.
Sorry, I thought that was all you ate, Mad Chin.
Fine. Where's the closest one?
And bringing in some more of the aspects of conversations with technology, the ability for the speech assistant to draw on data from the platform, things that it already knows about you, whether you only ever order from Chinese restaurants, where your current location is, all of those other bits of information it can pull together to help make the conversation with you appear more useful and usable and perhaps even a little more natural. In 2014, Microsoft introduced its desktop and mobile speech assistant, Cortana, and we started to see the arrival of something else.
Hey, Cortana. Guess what?
There are 2,335,981,212,665 possible answers to that question.
The, again, semblance of kind of humor and intelligent responses to a question. But of course, we're still cheating at this rate. They're Easter eggs buried inside the program. They have to be given a particular question, a particular key phrase or keyword in order to trigger the answer that causes the amusement. But still, it's another step closer in what feels a little bit more like natural conversation. In 2014, Amazon released its Echo, and we saw the first of the home digital speech assistants or voice assistants, devices that you have in one or more rooms in your house that you don't need to pick up, you don't need to, in fact, interact with at all in any other way apart from your voice. And suddenly, these technological conversations became a lot more useful. You could just do voice commands to find out a piece of information while you're doing the washing up, doing the laundry, working on something else on your machine. It doesn't really matter. You can just look up and ask a question.
Alexa, what is the forecast for Seattle, Washington?
Right now in Seattle, Washington, it's 44 degrees with showers. Tonight's forecast has rainy weather with a low of 39 degrees.
Alexa, set a timer for 5 seconds.
5 seconds, starting now.
So the introduction of useful tools like setting timer, finding out the weather, are becoming more and more prevalent in our lives. I have an Echo at home, and now when I get up and I go into my home office every morning, I ask it what's on my calendar, what's the weather today, can it turn on the radio for me, and then I settle down to work with a cup of tea. It's become, effectively, a pretty important part of my working life already. Google Now, in 2015, took interaction on this level a step further, and they introduced context awareness.
So, you want to see it in action? Yes? All right, let's do it. So, here he's listening to Skrillex, and you wonder, like me, what is his real name?
Okay, Google, what's his real name?
Skrillex's full name is Sonny John Moore.
Who knew?
So now you don't even have to ask, what is Skrillex's name? You can just say, what is his name? And based on the context of the conversation you're having with Google Now, it knows what the thing you're referring to is. It's context aware. And we're a massive step closer to human conversation. Humans do this all the time when we're speaking. So we've seen a lot of technological advancements over the past several decades, but it still remains, we've got a lot of work to do. Speech is incredibly powerful. We use it to persuade, to encourage, to confront, to love, to caress, and of course to amuse each other. There is a lot to language. We do an extraordinary amount of things by talking to each other. But it's also strange. We use idioms. In English, we have a phrase that it's raining cats and dogs, meaning it's raining really hard. We use phrases like that in pretty much every language around the world. Shortcuts or idioms to say something without actually coming out in clear and simple language to say it. We have different ways of saying things depending on where you are in the world. In England, we walk on the pavements at the side of the road. In America, they walk on the sidewalk. We also have dialect and regional variations of language. You say tomato, I say tomato. We have different words, different slang words for things, depending on where in a country you come from. If I talk to someone who comes from the very north of England, they will often say things using phrases that I don't understand because I come from the south of England, where they're not common. So speech is very, very strange. it's not even always needed for humans. Sometimes we gesture to say something. Means, I don't know. We point to things, we gesture and reference things. You might be asked, where is something? And we'll say, oh, it's over there. This happens to me all the time as a blind person, actually, if you're surprised. I'll ask someone, where is something? And like, over there. Thank you. It's really helpful. But we do it. It's instinctive. It's natural. This is how people communicate for the most part. And somehow, we've got to wrap all these things up into our technological conversations before we really get to a point where we're having natural conversations with technology. And so this is what we've got to do. To make synthetic speech sound normal, to make these conversations sound plausible, they've got to meet 3 basic criteria. They've got to be natural. Back in the days of using Dragon Naturally Speaking and the Macintalk, you had to be very formal in your language, very precise in the way you pronounce things, and you had to use very precise phrases. And if you got it wrong, even a little bit, the whole thing didn't work. So conversations now have to be more like we have with Siri and Cortana and Google's Assistant. They have to be more like just conversing with a friend. The speech itself from the technology side has to be intelligible. We had a lot of examples there where the sound quality was pretty difficult because of the age, but also the further back we were in time, the harder it was to understand what the synthetic speech was actually saying. The pronunciation wasn't as precise, the diction perhaps not quite as clear, or maybe it was just that very flat monotone that makes things very difficult to understand. And lastly, when we design conversations, they've got to be understandable. They've got to be appropriate to the environment. You wouldn't develop, for example, a singing telegram technology to deliver someone some very bad news that a relative was unwell, perhaps. We have to think about the language we use. It needs to be informal, but not so informal that it's impossible to detect the kind of hidden language that's being used as part of the conversation. So what can we do? Well, there are different aspects. We need to look at the synthetic speech itself, the thing that's going to talk to us. There are different ways of doing this. Formant speech synthesis is entirely artificial. So it's incredibly responsive when you use it in devices and platforms. It reacts very quickly. A lot of screen reader users, particularly on Windows, will still use Formant synthesis voices because they are so rapid in their response. It doesn't slow them down, waiting for the text-to-speech to kick in when they want something to be announced to them on screen. But the trade-off is that it sounds like this.
For millions of years, mankind lived just like the animals. Then something happened that unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk.
So there is punctuation in that sentence, and it sort of understands it. But it pretty much babbled that out all on one breath, all in the same tone of voice, with no intonation, no change of pitch, no nothing to make it interesting. More recently, we've come across a concatenative synthesis. This is a bunch of building blocks of pre-recorded human voices. You remember earlier I mentioned that we still used human voices, even in synthetic speech today. We break them down into tiny chunks of just phones or diphones, or sometimes words and phrases. And when the speech is needed, we string a series of them together in order to create the actual sentences we need. The trade-off is that you have a little bit better voice quality and some better characteristics to the voice, but the responsiveness is not quite as good as it is with Formant synthesis.
For millions of years, mankind lived just like the animals. Then something happened that unleashed the power of our imagination. We learned to talk.
In the past couple of years, a new kind of synthesis has emerged, though, parametric synthesis. And it stores all the characteristics of a voice as a set of parameters and rules in a data model, and then uses digital processing to produce the actual audio output. These are often neural network driven, and they're capable of producing all kinds of audio, music as well as speech. Until very recently, it took the computing power of a small airport to be able to get these things to work. But this year, Google has announced that a technology from WaveNet that uses parametric synthesis is now the technology that's behind all the speech output in all their Google Assistant tools. And this is what it can do.
Never had much faith in love or miracles. Never wanna put my heart on the line.
So I think you'll agree, singing has come a long way since Daisy Daisy in 1969, and the speech quality there is absolutely extraordinary. If you know you're listening to synthetic speech, you can tell, but if you don't, it's actually remarkably difficult to know that you're not listening to the voice of a real human being. So we're pretty close in terms of the capabilities of outputting synthetic speech, but how do we give that speech character in terms of creating apps and skills and other bits and pieces for the various platforms? We have a number of technologies, the oldest of which is voice XML, which has been around since the late 1990s, although its most recent edition was published about 10 years ago. And it's a markup language that is most often to be found in those dreadful phone menu systems that we all almost have to put up with. You phone the bank and you have 17 options that you've been forced to listen to, and then you can press 0 if you want to go home and cry afterwards. But this is the technology that underpins all of these things, the ability to mark up conversations and to segment them into chunks and phrases and words, much as we understand a conversation to be in human terms. In 2004, we had the first version of the speech synthesis markup language. This can be used in conjunction with voice XML. It can also be used standalone. And it enables us to give voice character. We can change the volume, the speed, the pitch, a number of other different characteristics of the voice that can help us bring some more humanity to speech. And if you develop skills for the Amazon Echo, it's SSML that's the markup language that you use there to give Alexa a little more differentiation when she makes different announcements. If you're thinking about speech on the web, there's a technology called the CSS speech module. It's been around almost as long as CSS has under different names. It's never quite made it into an official W3C recommendation, though, because it just doesn't have any support worth mentioning in browsers. iOS and Safari has a very, very little bit of support for this, and I think that's about it. But it's a great shame, because what it does, or would do if it were supported, is give us the opportunity to create oral or audio design as well as the normal graphic, visual design we expect from CSS. So, for example, if you had a news headline on a news site, you could perhaps raise the pitch of the voice that it was spoken in if you were listening to it with a screen reader. So we could add color and texture to the voice output for those particular users. But sadly, without some support, that may well never happen. We've got another technology, the Web Speech API from 2014. This lets us give voice input and voice output to web applications. So again, both halves of the conversation. We can create web apps that you can talk to, dictate, and also ones that will speak back to you. And just out of curiosity, a few years ago, I used the Web Speech API to write a proof of concept of how the CSS speech module could be used to change the experience of reading text for a screen reader user.
This sounds normal. This sounds loud. This sounds quiet. This sounds fast.
This sounds slow.
This sounds high.
This sounds low.
So even with that really simple example of just reading a little bit of text, how different an experience do you think that is from listening to the very flat monotone we heard with the formant synthesis there? It's not much change in variation of speed and volume, but it starts to give us a little bit of human characteristic when we listen to content, and that's an important piece of the puzzle. So how do we design the actual conversation? We've got various bits now. We can get the synthetic speech, we can give it some characteristics, but the really interesting part is how do we get that conversation to work? Some friends of mine at the Paciello group and I released the inclusive design principles a few months ago. Just a few very simple design principles that are based on the idea of putting people first. And I've tried to use those to think about designing voice applications, which interestingly wasn't an aspect we considered when we wrote them. We were thinking very much in terms of conventional web and app interaction. So it's been an interesting exercise to take a look at them in the focus of a voice conversation. So offer comparability, provide a comparable experience for people no matter how they want to use something. So this makes sense when you're talking about webs and web apps, but actually, what does it mean when you're talking about a voice interaction? That's a very singular, one-dimensional kind of exchange of information. Except it turns out that it's not. A lot of these platforms have alternative methods of getting to the conversation. You can view a conversation transcript on the Alexa app, for example. Many devices now, I think the Apple HomePod and new generations of the Echo are coming with little screens on the devices themselves. Of course, if you're talking to your phone, you've got a screen right there. But an important part of the conversation is making sure that everyone is able to engage in the conversation, even if they can't necessarily interact through speech itself. We haven't yet found a way to do speech input for many of these devices. Some do on phones, but it's still cumbersome. But we can at least make some good progress in terms of text output instead of speech for people who perhaps might find it difficult to listen to the audio output. Consider situation. People use technologies in all kinds of different situations, and the conversations we have with technology are exactly the same, of course. We might be in our kitchen baking when we want the Echo to set a timer. We might be in the car when we want Siri to do something on the phone. Depending on what you're up to, you might just be sitting in your lounge or your living room and you might want some music played, so you'll ask Cortana to get on the case for you. Situations do change, so we need to design conversations that accommodate people no matter how distracted they may be, no matter whether they really shouldn't be talking to the technology at all, or whether they're just chilling out and relaxed. So we don't want to do things like this. We don't want to be in a situation where the user is asking to open an app or a skill, and the thing replies, "I'm opening." Because as a user, now what? You know, what do I do now? I am lost already. The thing's barely got started, and I don't know what's expected of me. As humans, we give each other cues. We invite responses. And one very easy way we do this as humans, and of course we can do it as technological conversations, is to ask a specific question. So let the user know what's happening and ask them what they want to do next. Be consistent. Use familiar terms and phrases, and don't use unfamiliar technical jargon, legal jargon, all of those kind of things. Hey Siri is a great wake-up phrase. Alexa is another one. It's very easy to remember, it's very informal, it fits into the English language very, very well. It feels natural, in other words. But the jargon thing is a bit more difficult. So what we don't want to do is end up in a situation like this, where we're asking a user to say, initiate my flight status app and tell me about flight ZZ105, what's going on, because that's just not natural language. And if the thing then responds with something equally unnatural that contains, numerical error codes or fault numbers and puts time into a format, 0300, whatever it may be, that's very difficult to listen to, we're going to make that conversation really hard. As a human, you'd be like, what? Say it again? Pardon? But we can do better when we design the conversation. Instead of asking the user to use complicated language, we can ask them to use normal language. What time is my flight from Bristol to Amsterdam? Or what's the status of my flight? And when the thing replies, it can say, this is the status. It's delayed because of a mechanical fault, but your new departure time is 3:30 in the afternoon. And it becomes a lot easier to understand without all the complicated language. We need to give people control. We need to let people interact with content in the way that they want to, and it's the same within a conversation. We want to let people control the conversation when they're talking to technology. At the end of the day, these conversations are all about us humans wanting to get something done, so we need to make that as convenient and helpful as possible. So we don't want to do something like this. Ask an app about the most popular teas and have the app just reel off a great big long list of all the popular teas that might be available. Most people's memory will stop at about 3 items. Fortunate few of us might remember a couple more, but already we've been overwhelmed with information, and that's not good in a conversation. So what we should do when we're designing the conversation is respond by saying, the most popular is this, English breakfast. Would you like to hear some more? And let the user say, yes, please, in which case we can get the app to reel off a couple more popular teas. We've put the user in control of how much data they want to receive, and that's a much better experience when you're having a conversation. We need to offer choice. If we have lots of tasks, especially those that are non-standard, it's good to offer choice and a little bit of help to make sure people know what's expected of them. For a lot of people, voice conversations are very unexpected. They're non-standard interactions when it comes to technology. I won't get you to actually answer this out loud, but how many of you, when you first started talking to a piece of technology, felt like a complete idiot doing it? I did. I've got an Apple Watch, and the first time I realized I could answer a phone call on it, I was on a lift going down to a floor somewhere in a hotel, and without thinking, I answered the call, and what do I do with my hand? Who do I talk to? There's nothing to look at. It is an odd and to some extent kind of really strange interaction. So we need to guide, especially first-time users, but often all of us, in how a conversation should flow. So we don't want to do something like this. We don't want to have a user open an app to say, hey, I want to order a milkshake, and have the app offer us not only lots of options, but way too much information in terms of trying to help us. So if we order the milkshake, we don't want the app to say, you can have chocolate or strawberry or vanilla or peanut butter or something else. And if you want strawberry, say strawberry. And if you want chocolate, say chocolate. And if you want vanilla, say vanilla. And if you want peanut butter, say peanut butter. And do you know what? I'd have gone and had a cup of tea by now. What we do want to do is make it more natural. Just say, do you want chocolate or strawberry or another flavor? Again, give that control back. The user might say, what other flavors are there? We might hear that there are also vanilla and peanut butter. Which one would you like? Again, that question, that clear invitation to respond, and the user can say, chocolate, please. And that's a really fluid, simple, natural conversation that gets the job done on the behalf of the human. We want to prioritize content. We need to help people prioritize what they want to do. A lot of voice conversations are really quite capable. They can do a number of different things. So what we need to do when we design conversations is take an educated guess at what we think the most likely choice they're going to want to make is, and offer it up first. So we don't want to do something like this. Have the user open their recipe book app and have the recipe book say, so do you want to find a recipe, edit a recipe, delete a recipe, find an ingredient, look something else, do something else? Again, it's just too much choice, it's too overwhelming. Whereas we could probably say that this is a recipe app, so the most likely thing the user is going to want to do is, do you want to find a recipe or something else? Likelihood is they're going to say, yes, I want to find a recipe. But again, there's the option there to find out what else is available. So we're enabling users to consume the conversation in small chunks and direct the way the conversation goes, exactly as we do when we're talking to each other. We need to add value. Think about the different features and how they add value for different users. This is a really interesting one because it's something I come across pretty frequently because I listen to content on the web and everywhere else rather than look at it, is that you need to, when you're designing a conversation, remember that someone is listening to you. For the most part, they're not reading what you're saying. So you don't want to do something like this. If you read this on screen, it's an app that asks a scorekeeper what the results of a current match are. And the text is written very much in the style you would see it on screen. It has the name of the first team, Bristol, and then their score, which is 30. Then the score of the next team, which is 20, and then the name of the next team, which is the Harlequins. And then it says, you've got some peculiar time format, 35 minutes, I think, remaining, but it's 0035. Reading it, that probably makes sense. If you're used to reading, game scores, certainly in the UK or in Europe, you'll be familiar with this. But if you listen to it, it's horrible. Whereas if we write it in a fashion that is intended to be spoken, with 35 minutes to go, the score is Bristol 30, Harlequins 25, it becomes, again, very much more natural and understandable. We've put it back into that level of informality that humans understand, particularly those that follow, in this case, rugby. But having designed all these conversations, having thought about the inclusive design principles of designing a conversation, we've really got some big questions to answer when it comes to the entire notion of designing conversations with technology. We've got the matter of privacy. Not just privacy of the conversation in terms of how much are these devices retaining of the things that I say to it? What are they doing with that information? Are they storing it somewhere? We know that it's, quite often data is sent backwards and forwards between servers. How private is my information when I ask it what I want for dinner, where to book me a restaurant reservation, how late is my train or my plane, all of these things. There's also an interesting social aspect to privacy, of course, which is that you can't really have a private conversation with technology. My husband, Dan, who is here with me at the conference today, will attest to this at 2 o'clock in the morning when he's trying to turn all the lights off with our Echo without waking me up. And as soon as you start saying, Alexa, turn off the lights, she doesn't recognize the voice. We lack that kind of intelligibility, understandability on the point of the voice recognition on the technology side. So at some point you end up either just hitting the button on the thing anyway or just shouting at it and I wake up. But it's a very serious point. When you need privacy in an office, if we're doing voice conversations there, you don't want everyone in an office talking to their technology all the time. It would be an absolute riot. So we do need to think about how we manage privacy at all levels when we think about designing voice conversations. We need to think about security. I mentioned we know that a lot of our speech commands, our half of the conversation goes backwards and forwards between servers. How secure is that data? What happens with it when it's sent up remotely into the cloud? Is it stored anywhere for any length? Who has access to it? Under what circumstances? Can it be hacked? We've really got to get a lot better at thinking about security. And this, in fact, is a much wider Internet of Things, Web of Things issue. But it's perhaps all the more pertinent because when we talk to things, we tend to find a kind of natural affinity for them. And this brings me on to another point in a moment. But first, how do we identify ourselves when we're having a conversation? How do we identify ourselves securely? We're not at a point yet where actual vocal pattern recognition is a thing you find in most of our home technologies. So before we can start engaging perhaps with, say, our banks in any meaningful way or any other secure services, we've got to think reasonably hard about how we can securely and without question identify ourselves as part of a natural conversation. This one's all the more interesting because actually as humans in conversation, we don't really do it either. We still have to produce ID, we still have to sign a signature, but we do have better recognition of each other as individuals through a whole bunch of different senses, of course, the way our voices sound, the way the person looks, our memory of them and all of those things. But these questions too will have to be solved as we advance our conversations with technology. And lastly, that point I mentioned, trust. Because we tend to anthropomorphize things that we can talk to that start to sound like humans, the more we make these conversations successful, the more the speech sounds really like another human being, the more the artificial intelligence behind a lot of these platforms kicks in and gives us more and more convincing conversations, the more we're going to trust these technologies. And with trust comes a degree of carelessness about personal privacy and security. In one of the many articles I was reading when I was putting this talk together, this really interesting scenario was presented. What happens if we have a talking teddy bear? One that sounds very realistic, it converses with your child very easily and naturally, but at some point, somewhere in its makeup, it's got a little advertising node that every now and again will just give your child a bit of a nudge to say, hey, you know what? It'd be really good if we could go and buy some, I don't know, name your chocolate, name your toy, name your thing, it doesn't matter. What impact is that going to have when we really have got these conversations to the point where they feel so natural that we have an almost instinctive trust for them? When they become so familiar, so ubiquitous, and I'm pretty sure they will, that we trust them instinctively. We need to look out for that and figure out ways to protect ourselves against it, both in terms of the design of the conversation, but also in terms of the way we think about it. So there are some still really big questions to think about from the experience side of designing conversations with technology. So keep talking. We've come a long way. Stephen Hawking was right. For millions of years, we didn't really do very much in the way of communication at all. But then we did discover how to talk. Like I said at the beginning, we probably still haven't really got the hang of talking to each other just yet. The world would perhaps be a much nicer and more peaceful place if we did. But we are starting to talk with technology more and more and more. And all of us, everyone here, we've got a role to play in this because in the coming years, we are going to find ourselves designing skills, designing apps, designing tools, GPS systems, things for the kitchen that will engage with humans using speech. Most of the big tech companies are putting enormous resources into researching artificial intelligence, synthetic speech, all of these pieces of the puzzle that go into designing very real conversations. So we have a lot to think about in the coming years, but it's a really exciting place. I remember watching Star Trek and just longing for the day when I could say, computer, tea. And it would just arrive on a thing. I don't drink Earl Grey, so I can't complete that particular phrase. But we're still a long way from there, but I think it probably will happen. Perhaps not the synthetic tea, but we will get to a point where this is our default mode for interacting with content, I suspect. Our grandchildren or great-grandchildren may look at us and say, keyboards? The hell were they? What do you people like with your typing? Talk to it, Grandpa. This is all to come, though. We've got extraordinarily exciting possibility space ahead of us and a lot of things that are quite fun to play with in the meantime. So I hope this has been helpful in terms of helping you think about how to design a conversation. It's been a lot of fun being here. Thank you.
Hello, Léonie. Some questions. How do you feel about taking a few?
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. Roland asks, do you think people will accept talking to machines? And sort of an estimate about when.
Was that talking?
You think people will accept talking to machines, when it will just feel normal?
I think we will, yes. I'm British, and we're just about uncomfortable talking to anybody when it really comes down to it. And yet, you know, we are starting to talk to technology. And it does become, I was about to say thoughtless, that's not quite the right word. It becomes something we do without really thinking. I realized this when I woke up this morning in my hotel room and went to ask the Echo what the weather was outside. I've just got so used to having that conversation first thing in the morning that it was just, you know, when I was still half asleep, it just occurred to me to just carry on and do that as normal. So I think we've got a long way to go. We've got a lot of social changes to make in the way that we feel about having conversations in public, in the open, that privacy thing I mentioned. But yeah, I suspect speech is, for most of us, the most natural way to communicate, and I suspect that's likely to win out in the end.
Well, Anonymous is curious about what are some ethical concerns with synthetic speech? So ethical concerns. And this is connected to another question, actually. I can't find the name of the person. But there's this...
Okay, sure.
There's some technology that can simulate someone else's speech, where you type or something and it sounds like that person, but that person didn't say that.
Yes.
So concerns or thoughts about the ethics of this stuff?
That's a very good point. It's another question we are going to have to think very long and hard about, or more to the point, I think we probably have to accept that it's going to happen. What we have to do is figure out ways to protect ourselves against it. Technology, it's always been this way. Somebody will invent something and there are enormous positive and negative possibilities. I can't wait for the day when that kind of technology becomes more mainstream, because if I can sit and listen to, I don't know, Kenneth Branagh as my screen reader voice, hallelujah. I'll never get any work done, but you know what? Who cares? I just sit and listen to Morgan Freeman read me my email. How cool would that be? But yeah, you're right. The downside is that it does mean that someone can mimic you. So we're going to have to get much better at different ways of identifying ourselves, solving that identity problem in order to kind of make sure we protect ourselves against that.
Lucas has kind of a horrifying question. How do you feel about a horrifying question? Would the AI eventually have their own accents, idioms and dialects? So fast forward, what, 20 years, and there's an AI just yakking away.
Yes, I suppose it's possible. There was a bit of a thing recently, actually, about Facebook chatbots that the news widely reported were busy talking to themselves in a language that was pretty obscure to humans, and news around the world was just like, chatbots have invented their own language, and actually it was nothing of the sort. What they'd done was that they'd started taking shortcuts with their language until they'd kind of just snipped a little bit off here and a little bit off there, until what they were actually doing was conversing in such a condensed form of English, is that it took humans quite a while to figure out that that's what it was that they were looking at. So yes, as we use kind of, you know, deep learning systems, neural nets, and systems that are capable of learning, yeah, I think it's quite possible they could. But there would have to come a point where, our interaction with them would influence that as well. Accents and things don't very often develop unless you're talking to someone who's got the same kind of a thing. It's a conversational thing. A lot of words change their spelling because somebody mishears them, and that mishearing or mispronunciation gets repeated across hundreds and hundreds of conversations, and a couple of generations later the word is entirely different from the place it started. So technology might end up with language and accent of its own, but to a certain extent, if it's based on a learning system, that's still going to be influenced by the people they're talking to, and for a while at least, I hope that's still going to be us.
Thank you, Léonie.
That's okay. We're good. Thank you.